Take your Bibles, if you will, and turn to the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 2. Ecclesiastes, chapter 2. We have established the fact that the book of Ecclesiastes is all about the pursuit of fulfillment in this life. Lasting, permanent fulfillment in this life. It's the record or the journal of a man who had everything he needed in this life, including divine wisdom, who fully pursued all the good gifts God has given man for the purpose of finding lasting satisfaction. But as we've learned so far, the approach of turning the good gifts God has given us in life for enjoyment, turning those things into idols to worship in the hope of gaining lasting fulfillment, is what the author describes as under the sun and under the sun approach. His conclusion, after fully pursuing all of those things to the fullest, is that at best the payoff is temporary, at worst it's empty. Solomon describes the payoff of this foolish pursuit as a beautiful soap bubble that floats in the air and is glistening in the wind until it suddenly bursts and is gone. That's really a very accurate translation of the word vanity. It's the word hebel in the Hebrew. In fact, as we learned last Lord's Day, 2 Lord's Days ago now, often in the Word of God, the word hebel is used in connection with idols, and that gives us a key to understanding this book. That's really what is underlying the idea that Solomon is getting across in the book of Ecclesiastes. God describes this empty approach in Jeremiah chapter 2, verses 13 and 14. He says, "My people have committed 2 evils. They have forsaken me. They've taken their eyes off me, the fountain of living waters, to hew for themselves cisterns. I've given them everything they need for life, but they've taken their eyes off me. They've forsaken me to hew for themselves cisterns. Broken cisterns is what they are. They can hold no water." To say it another way, there are 2 types of people. Those who make idols out of God's good gifts, and those who worship God and enjoy the good gifts He has given us. And remember, to seek satisfaction in anything or anyone other than God is idolatry. And we're talking about the pursuit of a man's life. 2 types of people: those who worship God alone, fearing Him and obeying His commandments, and therefore are able to enjoy God's good gifts in this life, and those who worship the good gifts God has given us in this life, pursuing them for lasting fulfillment. Ecclesiastes, then, because of Solomon's wealth and power and wisdom, is the record of the most complete pursuit of idols any man has ever undertaken. And so, as I told you, there's much to be learned from this book. For the true follower of Jesus Christ, there's much to be learned, because we can have a tendency from time to time to add other little gods to the one true God we worship. Also, for the unredeemed who chase everything God has given man in life in an attempt to gain that lasting fulfillment. Now, here's where we are in the text. In chapter 1, Solomon concluded that everything is meaningless and fleeting because humanity rebelled against God and now lives in a cursed world where nothing we attempt to build our lives on will ultimately satisfy and provide lasting fulfillment. If this cursed world is all there is, then there is no profit to all of our activity, because nothing changes under the sun. That's a secular approach. That's an approach that takes God out of the picture, an approach apart from God. Solomon told us that we are trapped in a monotonous prison where nothing changes and then we die. That led Solomon to give his personal testimony about how he tried everything to find some kind of meaning in this life, but he concluded that nothing works. The end of chapter 1 set up Solomon's testimony, and now chapter 2 gives us more specific details of his search for lasting fulfillment, or what we could call life, seeking to find life in things that do not provide life. Now, if this all sounds hopeless, well then Solomon, catch this, is achieving his purpose. Remember, he is showing us the world from an earthly perspective, from a temporal perspective. This is the best man can do on his own. If we take a secular perspective, trying to understand the world on our own terms rather than on God's terms, we will never escape Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Now, each new piece of information Solomon gives us only plunges Solomon deeper into hopelessness. With an increasingly heavy heart, Solomon's research is driving him to the heart-wrenching conclusion, the fact that the best gifts in life cannot give him what he longs for most in this life. No person or no thing can. But like many before or since, Solomon will now turn from serious pursuits to the pursuit of pleasure in chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. Like a scientist or a philosopher, perhaps a detective, Solomon is going to experiment with all kinds of things to see what has lasting value or meaning. What in the end is really worth it? Is there any lasting fulfillment in the pursuit of pleasure, the pleasure of the senses? Well, we've already looked at the empty pursuit of wisdom. The result is in chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. Look at it. And I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness. That's not insanity. That's carnality. And foolishness. That's the trivial, foolish stuff of life. I realized that this also is striving after the wind, literally shepherding the wind. Why? Because in much wisdom, there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. The more he discovered about that pursuit, the more he was convinced that's an empty pursuit. There'll be a lot of smart people in hell. Hell will be populated with smart people. Smart people who were fools, professing to be wise, what? They became fools. Let's look at our second point, the empty pursuit of pleasure. The empty pursuit of pleasure. Now follow along as I read our passage beginning in verse 1 of chapter 2. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure. So enjoy yourself. And behold, it too was futility. I said of laughter, it's madness. And of pleasure, what does it accomplish? I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine while my mind was guiding me wisely, and how to take hold of folly until I could see what good there is for the sons of men to do under heaven in the few years of their lives. I enlarged my works. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself. I planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made ponds of water for myself from which to irrigate a forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves, and I had homeborn slaves. Also, I possessed flocks and herds larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. Also, I collected for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I provided for myself male and female singers and the pleasures of men, many concubines. Then I became great and increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also stood by me. All that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all of my labor, and this was my reward for all of my labor. Thus I considered all my activities which my hands had done, and labor which I had exerted, and behold, all was a soap bubble, and striving after wind, and there was no profit under the sun. Now at this point, Solomon might have been tempted to give up, but like I said, like most people without God, he turns to chase another idol. Idol 1 did not work, I'll find idol number 2. Look at verse 1. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure. So enjoy yourself, live it up. Behold, it too was futility. Solomon begins here by giving us his approach. He starts talking to himself, not about something that's life-changing, not about something that's lasting. He doesn't yet know that, but we do. But rather, this is something that might entertain him. One commentator said, within the house of hedonism, there are many rooms, and Solomon tries to sleep in them all. Tim Keller points out that it's not until Solomon already concluded that there are no answers in life that he turns to pleasure. If nothing that I do matters, and the world is going to burn up in the end, then I need to lighten up and pursue some pleasure. This is the mentality, the mindset of the man who is under the sun. Do not forget that. Now, the word test tells us that what follows is an experiment, a deliberate attempt to learn something from personal experience. The word pleasure shows what he wants to experience. He wants to experience pleasure in life. Now, the word pleasure can speak of the joy that comes from moral behavior. For instance, there's the joy in God and in worshiping him. But the examples that follow here make it clear that Solomon is talking about sensual, material joy, the things that make him feel good. And so he says, enjoy yourself. I said to myself, live it up, enjoy yourself. He adopts the lifestyle of eat, drink, and be merry. Now, you understand that the possibilities for sensual pleasure were nearly endless in Solomon's world. We perhaps have more access to such things, but he would have equal access given his position and his bank account. Who better then to access those possibilities than the king? He had a palace and all its servants at his fingertips. He had magicians and comedians and musicians. He had rooms full of wives and concubines. Did you catch the pronouns when we went through this? Did you notice that? Another word that gets repeated in every single verse in this passage is the word I. Yes, he's talking to himself. He's speaking autobiographically. So there are times when he needs to refer to himself, but the redundancy highlights the approach of the man living under the sun. In essence, his God is himself. He worships self. You could view Solomon as a self-indulgent man. This is the approach of a self-indulgent man. This redundancy highlights the approach of the man living under the sun. He's self-indulgent. He's pursuing self-centered pleasure. You could view Solomon as an experimental hedonist. In other words, he chooses to make his own personal happiness his chief end in life. I desire to pursue pleasure. doing whatever I could to please myself. In essence, this pursuit, like every other pursuit in life apart from God, is self-centered. But this one, more than some of the other approaches, has no redeeming value whatsoever. Now, there can be no question that our society has more avenues to pursue and enjoy pleasures than ever before. And so this is the way many people live today, and it's a temptation for all of us to live for ourselves rather than God. It's just another idol. And so Solomon turns from his consideration of wisdom and folly to the topic of pleasure. Pleasure. He hoped to find lasting fulfillment in pleasure, and he sets out to test its possibilities. Many people turn to pleasure. If not for ultimate meaning, then for a distraction from the lack of meaning or from the pain in their lives. Most of us make our decisions based on what will maximize our pleasure and our happiness. We look for what one comedian calls little islands of relief in what often is a painful existence. For Solomon, he knows the conclusion to this pursuit. He knows the conclusion to this pursuit. And so, even before narrating the exact parameters of his pursuit, he tells us his conclusion. Verse 1, look at it. What's the result? You already know the result. Verse 1, and behold, it too was futility, empty. In other words, pleasure was as much of a soap bubble as chasing wisdom was. Pleasure did not satisfy the longings of his soul any more than wisdom did. The word behold, we know that's an attention grabber. Don't miss this, he says. This demands our attention. Listen up, he says. This might surprise you, but this also, he says, is empty. Pleasure makes you feel good about life and perhaps even yourself for the moment. But it does not last, and in the end it is empty. And so his hedonism proved to be meaningless. Now, don't miss that as Solomon does throughout Ecclesiastes, he states the chase, he states the pursuit, and then he states the conclusion. What he's saying is that I chased pleasure harder and more thoroughly than anyone else ever could, and I can tell you it was empty. Verse 2. Here in verses 2 through 8, Solomon lists for us the categories of pleasure that he pursued. And the point is, his pursuit was thorough. Look at verse 2. I said of laughter. In other words, he experimented with comedy, a form of entertainment that many people use to make it through life. The comedian's clean. That's not a bad thing. It's a good thing to laugh. Proverbs talks about that. It's good for the soul. It's good medicine to laugh. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about those people who pursue laughter for the purpose of gaining lasting satisfaction. What happens? They feel insecure. They make jokes about something. They get down on themselves. They make fun of other people. When they're bored, they look for something to make them laugh. It's not new. The book of Proverbs, also written by Solomon, tells us that laughter and pleasure often hide grief and sorrow. Proverbs 14:13, even in laughter, the heart may be in pain. It's too painful, I'll laugh. Yet Solomon in Proverbs also tells us that the wise laugh. So it's about context. The difference between the fool and the wise person in Proverbs is the timing of their laughter and its object. But what Solomon is describing here is devoting your life to chasing the feelings that laughter brings. And do not forget, the pursuit he is describing is the pursuit of the man under the sun. There's nothing wrong with a good sense of humor, but Solomon was thinking of much more. He turned his life into a round of pursuing laughter. You read the stories of the comedians and you discover their life has often been miserable and painful and tragic. You can imagine the endless procession of court jesters and comedians frequenting the palace and making fun at the banquet tables. Understand, this was not innocent humor. This was humor that had immoral overtones, which in the end led to evil foolishness in the many pursuits of pleasure. And so while Solomon recognizes that there is an appropriate time for laughter, that's Ecclesiastes 3, we'll see that, he also notes that the wise person cannot always discern the times when it's right to laugh. And so what's his conclusion of this pursuit? Verse 2, it's madness. It is madness. Now, you have to keep this in context. This is a guy who searched his kingdom, found the funniest people, paid them to make him laugh. They were everywhere in the palace. What's his conclusion? It's madness. It's madness, and of pleasure, what does it accomplish? Here the word madness, again, does not refer to insanity, but rather to something sinful. According to Derek Kidner, it indicates moral perversity rather than mental oddity. Much of the humor today is filthy. It's perverted. And they're good. They can make you laugh. But you think about it, if you're saved, your conscience bothers you. What does humor and pleasure accomplish? What's he say? Nothing. And so when it comes to finding fulfillment in life, and pleasure and humor are the topics, they come up short. The pursuit of laughter turns out to be useless pleasure. Again, he's talking about the pursuit of eternal fulfillment in humor, and under the sun, pursuit of immoral and inappropriate laughter, not having a good sense of humor. And so Solomon says, I concluded that pursuing pleasure and laughter for their own sakes were empty. It was empty. What did they accomplish to help me find lasting meaning and purpose in life? What's he say? Nothing. Sadly, there are many people who laugh all the way to the grave, but there is nothing funny about the deathbed of someone who dies without Christ. For many, laughter only breaks the monotony of crying, and pleasure is only an intermission to pain. Solomon was trying to capture that feeling that comes from that intense laughter, but he was failing. So many today can empathize with Solomon. They've been down the road of pleasure, and they've found that it has led nowhere but to destruction. When amusement failed to satisfy him, notice that Solomon turns to chase another idol. Verse 3, he found a lubricant for his laughter. Verse 3, I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine while my mind was guiding me wisely. Now, Solomon knew well the negative effects of alcohol. He was the one who wrote, "Wine is a mocker, strong drink is a brawler, and whoever is led astray by it is not wise." He understood the effects of alcohol. And so he's talking about filling his body with wine in a controlled experiment while not giving himself over to drunken debauchery. Drinking in moderation and then soberly and thoughtfully assessing his experience. It makes sense. If he's plastered, he can't rightly ascertain what he was thinking, what he was doing. He's not an alcoholic, but he's a connoisseur making careful use of wine. Now, it almost goes without saying that almost no one can do what Solomon did. For most attempting this pursuit, they wind up as alcoholics. What Solomon is doing here is probably describing being a connoisseur in selecting the right kinds of wine that go with the best food at the lavish banquets he gave in abundance. And with his wisdom guiding him, he experimented with the proper balance of wine and folly to try to find the perfect combination of amusement, and that was all a part of enjoyment at the banquet scene. He wanted to try out this lifestyle to the fullest, and he had the adequate means to do so. But regardless, his conclusion here is no different than any other pursuit of the man living under the sun. Verse 3, and how to take hold of folly until I could see what good there is for the sons of men to do under heaven the few years of their lives. Now, see that expression, to take hold of folly? That speaks of all those harmless and enjoyable forms of nonsense that are known. And so what Solomon is describing here is wine and folly. Drunk people do the dumbest things, and they laugh at the dumbest things. But his mind is intact, and so he's assessing all of this. He's describing here, when he describes wine and folly, he's describing the lowest level on which the experiment operated. As Solomon says, what he was doing here is experimenting with them to see what good there is for the sons of men in that which they do under heaven. That's a synonymous phrase with under the sun, same phrase, during the appointed number of the days of their life. In other words, the lasting effect of wine and foolishness, he says, are not very substantial. As he says, they are as brief as every man's life. This is not the kind of high that's going to carry out into eternity. And so right here at the end of verse 3, Solomon introduces a theme that will become increasingly prominent throughout the rest of the book, namely the brevity of life. Makes perfect sense. Devote yourself in this life to something other than God, and you have spent less than a millisecond of your life on something that's useless. You will then have all of eternity to think about the foolish God that you pursued. Why does he talk about the brevity of this life? Because it's bigger than this life. Scope of eternity. One of the main reasons people pursue pleasure is because life is so short. That's the old popular commercial, right? Life is short. Grab for all the gusto you can. Solomon, in his pursuit of lasting fulfillment, grabbed for all of that gusto, and he still comes up empty. Well, he now shifts from the purely sensual and self-centered pleasure of alcohol to the more grandiose achievements of constructing large works. Look at this, verse 4. I enlarged my works. Well, his works were impressive. He enlarged them. I built houses for myself. The history of that period confirms that Solomon was one of the greatest builders of any era. Knowing that the selfish temporal pleasures of amusement or alcohol resulted only in emptiness, surely leaving a legacy, solid monuments for future generations that would say, this was Solomon, and here is his great work. Surely that will bring some lasting satisfaction. Solomon must have been thinking, well, after I die, that building will still be here. Notice the pronouns again. In these next few verses, Solomon refers to himself no fewer than 10 times. Instead of doing all of this building for God or for the people of Jerusalem, he's doing it all for himself. The pronouns tell us that Solomon's efforts are all still self-centered. So he first mentions his many building projects. He says, I enlarged my works. He is implying, who built more than I did? He's saying that the level of his achievements was unmatched. He initially concludes that his experiment was successful inasmuch as he obtained every material object he had desired, and he reached the highest social status in his society. I wanted to build it. I saw it. I did it. He's looking for fulfillment in this. His great building projects are clearly listed for us in the historical books, 1 Kings 7, 1 through 12, and chapter 9, verse 15, 2 Chronicles 8, 1 through 6, Song of Solomon, chapter 8, verse 1. It all associates Solomon with building. And the idea here is that if Solomon could find no significance or profit in his building, well then what hope is there for anyone else? Don't miss the fact here that all of his building, again, is only for himself. And not for public building, not for public housing, not for philanthropy. Interesting to note, it took him 7 years to build the temple, right? And it was spectacular. It took him 13 years to build his own house. Verse 4. I planted vineyards for myself. This speaks of Solomon's viticultural endeavors. You know that word, viticultural? His cultivating and harvesting. The cultivation and harvesting of his sprawling vineyards. Verse 5, I made gardens and parks for myself, and I planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. The word for parks, translated into Greek, is paradisos. We get the word paradise from that. That gives you an idea of the types of stunning parks that Solomon built for himself. He was equally involved in horticulture and silviculture, that's planting flowers and fruit trees. That phrase, all kind of trees, is reminiscent of the description of Eden found in Genesis. That same phrase is used 3 times in the creation account. Once again, this heightens the magnificence of Solomon's garden paradise. Understand, If this man built a house, it was perfect. If he planted a garden, it was perfect. If he had a vineyard, it was perfect. Everything he did was in the pursuit and on the basis of excellence. Verse 6, I made ponds of water for myself, from which to irrigate a forest of growing trees. Such magnificent gardens and parks could not survive without the proper water, and so Solomon constructed irrigation pools to provide the necessary water for their cultivation and their growth. Engineers tell us it's some of the greatest engineering feats in the history of the world. The language, particularly the plurals here, emphasizes the magnificence of his works. Don't miss this. His only purpose in pursuing these things is self-pleasure, not philanthropy. Plural, everything. Not a house, houses. Not a vineyard, vineyards. Gardens, parks, trees, ponds. It literally sounds like a second Garden of Eden, especially with all the fruit trees. And there are commentators who believe he was attempting to create a second paradise on earth, a second Garden of Eden. In the words of Derek Kidner, he created a little world within a world, multiform, harmonious, exquisite, a secular Garden of Eden full of civilized and agreeably uncivilized delights, with no forbidden fruit. The palace of Solomon was paradise regained. And again, for the third time, it's all for him. It's all for him alone. But that's not all. Beyond his building projects, beyond his gardening, Solomon was the wealthiest man on earth. Verse 7, I bought male and female slaves, and I had home-born slaves. Given the scope of his building projects and the size of his property, Solomon needed a huge workforce to run his daily operation, and so he purchased many slaves, and the slaves he owned bore many children who also belonged to their master's house. To feed them all, he had a massive number of animals. Look at verse 7. Also I possessed flocks and herds, plural, plural, larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. Notice that Solomon tells us that he had more herds and flocks than any person before him in the history of Israel. The flocks speak of the smaller livestock, such as sheep and goats. The herds refer to large farm animals like cattle. Some of these would be used for the many sacrifices. In particular, listen to this. The king offered 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep when the temple was dedicated. To care for that number of animals required many servants as caretakers and is an indication of the extent of Solomon's livestock, because the number sacrificed was only a small portion of his entire flock. At the same time, Solomon no doubt also had prize livestock, the best in all Israel, and as they would discover, the best in the known world, and he had every reason to be proud of them as he relished the memory of those interests that he pursued so passionately. From 1 Kings 4:23, we learn that he had so many animals that every single day the chefs in his royal kitchen would prepare 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides deer and gazelles and roebucks and fattened fowl per day. Here's what you need to understand about this. You look at the language here, and it's obvious that Solomon, at this point in his life, treated both animals and people as commodities to use, to supply his needs, and inflate his ego. His servants, male and female, were financially needy and dependent on him. The fact that he had homeborn servants means that either he did not allow them to leave, as the law of Jubilee in Leviticus 25 demanded, or they willingly stayed with him for life. The fact that he would list animals and people together tells us that he held both of them in low esteem. The listing of the magnitude portrays Solomon as boastful and arrogant and inconsiderate. Now get this. Why did the man have so many cows? Not a joke. Why? Because he wanted to be bigger than anyone else, and he assumed that in the pursuit of being greater than anyone else, he would find lasting fulfillment. Well, he rounds out his description of sensual pleasures by reverting to 3 more items. He returns, in essence, to the level of sensuality he began back in verse 3. First, he possesses great amounts of precious gold and silver, the money of his day. Second, he constructs a choir. He builds a choir to entertain himself. And then third, he describes his sexual explorations. So look at verse 8. Also, I collected for myself silver and gold and the treasures of kings and provinces. Solomon accumulated an insane amount of silver and gold. And remember, he did this for the purpose of finding lasting satisfaction and fulfillment. This is the mentality that says, if I just had more money, I could do what I want. Silver and gold were considered the chief glory of that age for many. You'll notice that some of his wealth came from taxes on his own people and some from the tribute of foreign powers, but notice that it all came from someone else. Look at 1 Kings chapter 10. 1 Kings chapter 10. First Kings chapter 10, look at verse 14. Now the weight of gold which came into Solomon 1 year was 666 talents of gold. And besides that, from the traders and the wares of the merchants and all the kings of the Arabs and the governors of the country. King Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold, using 600 shekels of gold on each large shield. He made 300 shields of beaten gold, using 3 minas of gold on each shield, and the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. Moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with refined gold. There were 6 steps to the throne, and a round top to the throne at its rear, and arms on each side of the seat, and 2 lions standing beside the arms. 12 lions were standing there on the 6 steps on the one side and on the other. Nothing like it was made for any other kingdom. All King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None of it was silver. None was of silver. It was not considered valuable in the days of Solomon. For the king had at sea the ships of Tarshish with ships of Hiram. Once every 3 years the ships of Tarshish came bringing gold and silver, ivory, and apes and peacocks. So Solomon became greater than all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. All the earth was seeking. You say, how can he have wisdom if he's doing such dumb things? What's the wisdom? The wisdom of the man under the sun. This is the world's best approach. All the earth was seeking the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. That's the spiritual wisdom. He hadn't lost that. He had ignored that. They brought every man his gift, articles of silver and gold and garments and weapons and spices, horses and mules, so much year by year. Now Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen, and he had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, and he stationed them in the chariot cities and with the kings in Jerusalem. With the king in Jerusalem, the king made silver as common as stones in Jerusalem. And he made cedars as plentiful as sycamore trees that are in the lowland. You ever been to Israel? You know it's covered with rocks. Also, Solomon's import of horses was from Egypt and Kue, and the king's merchants procured them from Kue for a price. A chariot was imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150, and by the same means they exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and to the kings of the Arameans. So, Solomon did not just have money, he had military victories and fame because he subdued the surrounding nations, and he had so much money that silver was as common as stones. Don't miss the sarcasm here. Stones literally are everywhere in Israel, as I just said. He also had ships. Every 3 years, they would collect booty to be brought back to him. David Jeremiah writes this: "The immensity of Solomon's wealth is beyond adequate description." But we'll give it a try anyway, he says. In Kings 10:14, we find that the weight of gold that came to Solomon yearly was 666 talents of gold. In current dollars, Solomon's annual income of just gold was nearly $304 million. Besides that, from the traveling merchants, from the income of traders, from the kings of Arabia, and from the governors of the country. There were many other sources of income. Silver was so abundant that it wasn't even counted. Therefore, we can safely round the 304 million per year up to 500 million, $500 million of annual income without fear of overstatement, he says. There are people in the world today whose lifetime, he writes, whose lifetime net worth is counted in the billions, but much of it is in the form of paper, not hard assets, as were Solomon's. But even in this age of wealth, there are very few whose annual income approaches Solomon's. The writer of 1 Kings sums up by saying, King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches. It's easy to see why. If we had walked into Solomon's palace during the golden age of Israel's history, we would have seen precious stones from Africa, spices from Arabia, almond and sandalwood from India, ivory from India and Africa, cedars from Lebanon. Solomon had 40,000 stalls for his chariot horses and 12,000 horsemen. His awe-inspiring temple left the nations breathless. Gold was found everywhere in its design, stairways beautifully ornamented, pillars and posts, curtains and courtyards, all made of rare and costly materials. A nearly infinite array of servants populated it, dressed in gorgeous clothes. Rich cuisine, costly uniforms, expensive animals were imported from all over the world. It was a building worthy of a king whose wisdom and splendor eclipsed that of all the rulers on earth. Solomon rightly claimed that he was greater and wealthier than any of his predecessors in Jerusalem. Look at verse 8. I provided for myself male and female singers. With his unending wealth, Solomon purchased gifted singers to form choirs. He had men's choirs and women's choirs and mixed choirs. And the reference to singers here gives insight to Solomon's reputation as a patron of the arts. The word for singers, gifted singers, tells us that Solomon purchased for himself a quality of music that no other place on earth could afford or equal. Like a radio, Solomon had the very best musicians at his constant disposal for nothing more than his pleasure. When they were not performing for him, they were rehearsing to perform for him because he could call on them at any time to sing for him. Constant concerts, musical plays, all from the royal orchestras and choirs. It makes sense that the royal court of Solomon would be filled with music, especially when we remember that Solomon himself was a musician, writing some 1,005 songs, according to 1 Kings 4, verse 32. He's not done. Verse 8. I provided for myself the pleasures of men, many concubines. Here he speaks of many concubines. What could be more perverted than concubines? Many concubines. 1 Kings 11. Look at that. 1 Kings 11 gives us the statistics here. This is mind-blowing. 1 Kings 11, verse 1. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. Solomon, however, held fast to these in love. Look at this, verse 3. He had 700 wives. You say, well, now wait. There is no way you can convince me the man was wise if he had 700 wives. The wisdom of the world. It's the under the sun wisdom. 700 wives, princesses, 300 concubines. 300 concubines. Oh, look at this. And his wives turned his heart away. He had more sexual partners than anyone could possibly imagine. And so exercising an almost godlike creativity and control, Solomon made better homes and gardens. He was an architect, he was a builder, he was a developer. He designed and built mansions of pleasure. He surrounded himself with music and women to use as he wished whenever he wished. And so get this. Solomon has concluded that in the end, wisdom and reason alone don't provide lasting fulfillment. And so he then turned to see if wisdom and wealth will make a difference. And the wealth helps the pursuit of the sensual pleasure. This is stunning. What he has mentioned here, almost casually, are the things in life that men would and do sell their souls for. This is exactly what man does. But look at this. At this point, in verses 9 through 11, we see Solomon's conclusion to pursuing lasting fulfillment, or what we would call life in the sensual pleasures of life. Look at verse 9. Then I became great. Then I became great and increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. The expression, I became great, literally, I became exceedingly great, has an unusual force of strength in the Hebrew. It is deliberately boastful. Literally, he says, I was great. And I kept on getting greater. There's no doubt about it that none of Israel's kings, or for that matter, no other king could ever match Solomon for splendor and greatness. Solomon says, in essence, I've lived better and lived harder than anyone else. Yes, he was the greatest, yet at the same time, while in full pursuit of his many pursuits, he kept a scrutinizing eye on all that he did because his wisdom remained with him. He ignored the spiritual wisdom. He had the temporal wisdom that enabled him to accurately assess what was happening. Verse 9, my wisdom also stood by me. The God-given wisdom did not depart while he gave himself completely and passionately to his pursuit of sensual pleasure. He was in ongoing, unrepentant sin. His thinking was the thinking of an under-the-sun man. He chased it all while retaining his wisdom. He kept his mind alert to evaluate possible benefits during the sensual experience. You say, why would God allow him to do that? So he could write the book. And so he assures us that the experiment has been carried on in a thoroughgoing manner so that later no one might be able to charge him with not having been sufficiently thorough in making the test of such delights. God allowed Solomon to maintain his human wisdom so that he could give us the accurate assessment of his pursuit. Verse 10. All that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all my labor, and thus was my reward for all my labor. He said, I chased all the pleasures of life. I exercised no restraint, no self-denial in my pursuit for meaning in sensual pleasure. He explored fully the delights of wine and women and song, as well as architecture and gardening. What's new in this verse is that Solomon believed pleasure was a consequence of his efforts. I felt good. That phrase, all that my eyes desired, is literally anything that my eyes requested. If I saw it and wanted it, I took it. Whatever he wanted, he got for himself. That's a sentiment that he repeats in the next sentence. The phrase, my labor, tells us how diligently he pursued those things. He worked hard at this. The Bible obviously warns against the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the boastful pride of life. The psalmist was heeding this warning when he prayed, turn my eyes from looking at worthless things and give me life in your ways. But Solomon ignored all of that. Whenever he viewed something he wanted, he took it. Whenever he was tempted to indulge in a fleshly pleasure, he did so. There was nothing he denied himself, nothing visibly entertaining or inwardly satisfying, and he did this because he thought he had it coming to him. I deserve it. I deserve to be happy. I deserve it, he would tell himself, as the reward for all my hard work. What was the result? What is the result of the man who pursues any and every pleasure as their main passion in life as they seek for lasting fulfillment? Well, you already know. You already know what he's going to say. But the unredeemed man doesn't. After experiencing every conceivable pleasure, everything the world had to offer, all of which, by the way, are gifts from God when approached from an above-the-sun approach, Solomon still had not gained anything out of any of it. Verse 11, thus I considered all my activities. I sat down, I thought through all of it, which my hands had done, and the labor which I had exerted. I worked so hard to pursue these things. The word consider literally means to face it, to look someone or something right in the eye. Solomon here says, I faced up to my situation. I viewed my life as it really is, and he wants us to know that it's ugly. The pursuit of life under the sun is empty, and it doesn't matter the category. How does he describe it? Well, the same way he described the last pursuit. Look at verse 11. And behold, that's emphatic. Don't miss this, he says. All. You know what that means? All. All of it. All of it was vanity. What's the word? Hebel. What's the picture? It was all a soap bubble. Pretty, floating in the air, poof, gone. Driving after wind is a good way to describe it, he says. Literally, shepherding the wind. It's a soap bubble. It's trying to harness the wind. And there was no profit under the sun. This is a man who had access to everything a man could ever have in this life. And the result was total and utter emptiness. Solomon had made a timeless error in his quest for meaning. He sought it in things and experiences. He searched in wisdom, in wild living, in work, in wealth, all in vain. The object of his search, lasting fulfillment, was in fact unavailable because it was all pursued under the sun. Centuries later, another wise man, C.S. Lewis, corrected the assumption that ultimate meaning can be found in anything in this world. Listen to this. The books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them. It was not in them. It came through them, and what came through them was longing. These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, are good images of what we really desire, but if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshipers. For they are not the thing itself, they are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have not visited. Listen, this is one of the main reasons why Ecclesiastes is in the Bible. It is here to convince us not to love the world or the things in the world. This message is not intended to discourage us or to make us any more depressed than we already are, but its intent is to drive us back to God, for in God we have all that we need concerning life and godliness. You cannot possibly pursue the things of this world to the degree that Solomon did. His pursuit was perfect. You couldn't do it any better than he did it. The result? Emptiness. Utter emptiness. What's the message? Do not make the same mistake. Some say that the height of foolishness is to watch others fail and then follow in their footsteps. Well, I'm different. That won't happen to me. There is a God in heaven who has sent his Son to be our Savior. Life in Jesus Christ, that Savior provides the only lasting fulfillment there is. It's an eternal fulfillment. And it is available to those who commit their life in denying themselves, being willing to die for Christ, and doing what the book tells them to do. Father, thank you for our time tonight. As we go through this passage and we think through these principles, we know from the news, we know from our own experience, we know from friends who are desperately living their life, trying to find meaning in life. They can't find what they're searching for because they're looking in the wrong places and they're looking to the wrong stuff. Father, for those of us who you've saved from the penalty of our sins, we're so grateful that you enabled us to get rid of the foolish false idols, and that you convict our hearts when we do add another little idol here and there. We pray that we would be diligent to have only one God and worship only one God. That would be the one true God, you. For those here tonight, we know there are some who don't live for you. They do reject you. I pray, Father, you would do whatever it takes to crush them, to bring them to the point that they recognize they must bow the knee to you if they have any hope of escaping an eternity in hell. So, Father, use what we learn to shape our lives so that we might grow into the likeness of the Son. Father, convict those who reject you, praying that you would draw them to yourself. All this, Lord, we pray in your name. Amen.